Hello, I'm Eileen Said. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, almost half of all European investments in China come from Germany. The chancellor is under pressure to cut back on business with Beijing. But is his country too dependent on the Chinese market? Also this week, polluters should pay compensation for the damage caused by climate change. That is the message from developing nations at the COP27 climate summit. But will rich nations foot the bill? While the world moves away from fossil fuels to save the planet, the tiny nation of Guyana is balancing an oil boom and its threat to the environment. The Ukraine war exposed the risk of Germany's decades-long reliance on Russian gas. It's been scrambling ever since to reduce that dependency. Now it appears the German chancellor has another problem. Members of his government, the opposition and Western allies are worried about the country's economic dependence on China. Olaf Scholz recently went on a controversial visit to Beijing after an even more controversial sale of its Hamburg port terminal to a Chinese company. Step Vassen reports from Hamburg.
After Rotterdam and Antwerp, Chinese state company COSCO has bought a stake in Europe's third largest port, Hamburg. The Chinese investment in one of the 4 container terminals was scaled down from 35 to 24.9% after Chancellor Olaf Scholz came under fire over the deal. But many in Germany are still unhappy.
On the one hand, they want to become independent from Russia, and on the other, they are giving away something so important. I think that's sad. This has been a favorite project of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who used to be mayor here, and pushes his own interests.
It's not only Scholz's coalition partners who have warned against the deal, there's concern outside Germany too.
People in Brussels, but also in Paris and a lot of other European member state capitals, there was a lot of frustration and outrage of wait, what's Germany doing? Why are they going forward with this? I thought we were supposed to be decreasing our dependencies. When we're talking about critical infrastructure and we're talking about the nature of China's political and economic system and the nature of a company like COSCO, I think we should be a bit more cautious, especially now in a post-Russian invasion of Ukraine world.
The fact that China doesn't allow similar investments in its own ports has also been an argument against the deal for some.
The nervousness about a Chinese stake here in Germany's largest container port shows how the country has been struggling with its dependency on Russia. Many fear that mistakes made back then will be made again. But so far, business interests have prevailed.
Hamburg feared it would lose competitiveness against other European ports without COSCO's investment. The port was already struggling to attract enough business.
Sometimes discussions are a bit exaggerated because there is a concern and it's an understandable concern what has happened in the Ukraine. We take the concerns serious, but they are minor from our perspective. Instead of what we can win as a society and of course as an economy like the German ones, but the whole Europe as well.
But other European nations have accused Germany of putting their own interests first when it comes to China. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, Hamburg.
Let's take a closer look at the numbers. China is Germany's biggest trading partner, and the value of imported and exported goods reached more than $242 billion last year. That is up by 15% from 2020. More than 12% of Germany's total imports came from China in 2021. The chemical company BASF is expected to invest almost $10 billion in its new plant in South China by the end of this decade. And China made up 40% of Volkswagen's worldwide deliveries in the first 3 quarters of this year. It's also the top market for other automakers like Daimler and Mercedes. Now, to discuss all of that, I'm joined from London by Klaus Vistesen. He's the chief Eurozone economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. Thank you for joining the programme, sir. How important is China to Germany's economy?
Well, I mean, it's an important part. It's an important part of Germany's economy, and it's an important part of the Eurozone economy. And I think the most important thing to mention here is that China has become more important over time. Europe has become more integrated with China over time, especially in manufacturing goods, but also in overall capital flows. So China plays a big role. I mean, it's not the biggest role. Germany trades more with its neighbors in Europe, the US and the UK, if you look at it sort of in total trade, I think. But still, China is a big part, and therefore, sort of this sort of geopolitical tensions, which is also now along the West-China axis, is a challenge for Europe and Germany.
But is Germany dependent on China? I ask that because while China tops the rankings of Germany's trading partners, we also have the United States, France, Poland, other European countries, all representing between 5 and 8% of Germany's total trade. So it does appear they are actually quite diversified when it comes to trade.
Well, they are. I mean, and it would be wrong to say that Germany is dependent on China in any way, because I mean, a lot of the stuff that Germany trades with China, especially on the import side, it's possible they will be able to get that from somewhere else, at least over time. But that doesn't mean, of course, that, you know, a rupture in that relationship wouldn't be economically damaging. But no, Germany's not dependent on China in that sense. That's
so how
true.
damaging would it be?
Well, I think that there's a political and an economic aspect here. I think that as far as the answer to that question depends on how quickly, right? The severance of the economic relationship with Russia, for example, in the context of the war, happened overnight or is happening very quickly. It seems like in this case with China, it's something that's going to be a little bit more slow moving in terms of sort of what the economic relationship between Europe and indeed the West and China is going to look over time. So far, it's not something that's really, I think that's sort of an acute sort of economic hit, if you will. But again, it depends on how quickly it happens.
Why is the Chancellor Scholz going against the rest of his coalition partners to continue this love affair with China, given the obvious risks we've been talking about?
Well, I don't know whether Germany has a specific love affair with China. Germany's a trading nation. It trades with other countries, right? I think actually what's happened over the last couple of years is that it's the US that's moved, right? I mean, the US itself has a strong economic relationship with China over time, and suddenly now it's selling the idea that, you know, we're in an existential conflict with China. And of course, that might not be in Europe's interests at this point in time. But of course, Europe is part of that Western axis, if you will. So Europe will have to go along with that in a way. So I think, you know, Europe is stuck a little bit in the middle here in terms of trying to maybe avoid, you know, tensions that increase too much. But so in a way, I wouldn't call it a love affair. It's just, you know, an attempt to sort of preserve the status quo or not backtrack too much.
The Europe question is interesting, isn't it? Because I guess you could wonder, how does Germany's economic ties with China affect the rest of Europe? I mean, why so much concern from Europe about Scholz's recent business trip to China?
Well, the concern is obviously that if economic integration with China increases at this time where the political relationship has changed, then of course there could be a geopolitical risk element to this, right? For example, there's been a lot of talk about allowing China to invest in a German harbor in Hamburg, and that could be sort of maybe 3-4 years ago, that's not a problem. But now with the politics change, suddenly, you know, that could be a challenge. We've seen other, you know, examples of this, especially with, you know, the classic example a little further back was Huawei's 5G infrastructure investments in Europe, where suddenly a lot of countries decided that Huawei weren't allowed to do that, even though a couple of years before, you know, that wasn't controversial. So I think it's elements like that where suddenly economic projects and relationships that were uncontroversial are suddenly being seen in a different light, and therefore, you know, it becomes controversial.
When we talk about the German companies that are exposed to China or invest in China, do they tend to be certain ones in particular, like the car manufacturers, or is it a range of companies?
It's a range of companies. I would say that a big part of German manufacturing has some kind of relationship with China at this point. Either they sell into China, they've got a factory in China, or they import important manufacturing inputs from China, right? And as I said before, it's depending on sort of where you are in that value chain and how big your relationship is with China. You know, you might be able to relinquish yourself from that and go somewhere else. But that's very difficult to know sort of before we see how quickly this moves.
We can't forget that China itself has had its own economic problems. It's had its very restrictive COVID strategies. Has that forced some German companies to adapt, to diversify away from China?
It's possible. I think that a lot of Western companies have been quite surprised with the turn in Chinese politics and sort of and economics and sort of post-COVID. It seems like Xi is galvanizing his power in China. Is becoming a little bit more centralized. And of course, with zero COVID, I mean, there's no end to zero COVID because you're always going to have a case somewhere. And that obviously has probably forced some companies, or at least some companies must be thinking about revisiting their economic relationship with China, at least as far as sort of further investments are concerned. You also have a real estate bubble that is now bursting in China. And so that also plays in. So yeah, I think they have, but of course China is still a big market, but still it's a changing market in that sense for sure.
Given the uncertainties facing Europe and Germany specifically with energy and energy prices and recession and so on, can Germany afford to keep its distance from China?
I mean, I would say over time you can afford anything, you can adjust, right? But in general, this idea that the West, is now in like I said, in an existential conflict with China, that China is now an adversary, both economically and even militarily, perhaps. That's just not, from Europe's perspective at this point in time, just not a very good story. Europe is not very well served with that. And I say this obviously knowing full well that Europe is an ally with the US. So if that's the road we're going down on, Europe only has one side here, and there's no fence in the end. But I think what we're seeing in Germany is a reflection of this fact that at this point, that's just not in Europe's interest. Europe still has an interest in having some kind of economic relationship with China, even as China perhaps changes into something different. I think that's what we're seeing.
Really interesting to talk to you, Klaus Vistesen, Chief Eurozone Economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
From devastating floods in Pakistan to drought-withered crops in East Africa, COP27 summit follows a year of extreme weather patterns. These disasters are estimated to cost the developing world more than $500 billion in damages annually by 2030. And poor countries have been urging big polluters to pay compensation for the losses and damages they've already suffered as a result of the extreme weather. Now, until now, climate financing has only focused on lowering carbon dioxide emissions and helping communities adapt. But this year, for the first time, loss and damage compensation is top of the COP27 agenda. A new report says developing nations need $1 trillion a year in climate finance. But rich countries have so far failed to even deliver on an earlier pledge to raise $100 billion a year by 2020 to support developing nations in reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And now, of course, with the ongoing war in Ukraine and the cost of living and energy crisis, getting governments from developed nations to agree to these measures is going to be difficult. Joining us from London is Katharina Hillenbrand von der Neyen. She's the head of corporate research and head of clean tech at Carbon Tracker. Thank you for joining us, Katharina. Who's to blame for some of the climate change-linked extreme weather events we've seen this year in parts of the developing world?
Well, it's very hard to say there is a blame. We know that they're happening. We know what the causes of climate change are. They are clearly human. It's now the question of how do we come to a climate outcome, and particularly now that the COP process is on, that allows us a pathway that mitigates the worst damage, i.e. achieving a 1.5 degrees scenario.
Back in 2009, rich countries pledged this $100 billion a year in climate financing to help poorer countries adapt to climate change. That was a voluntary system for adaptation and mitigation rather than the reparation and damages that are going to be discussed this time round. Given that target was not met, how optimistic are you that this whole idea of loss and damage will be successful?
I think it's a very difficult discussion, particularly in the current context where you have recessionary economic environments in many regions. It will be complicated. However, clearly we need to think about financing mechanisms. We need to think about knowledge transfer mechanism, technology support mechanisms, and access to finance for developing nations.
The whole idea of reparations, it's hugely contentious, isn't it? I mean, aren't developing countries concerned that providing funding could be construed as an admission of legal liability and then end up triggering claims on a major scale?
Well, clearly there are a lot of complexities around that. You've just mentioned some of them. I think it is an area where if we think more about knowledge sharing, if we think about various areas of financial support where the global north clearly has an ability to do that. But there can be various shapes or forms where you do not see that sort of legal risk and where financial and technology and other support can happen.
OK, so let's talk about the fund itself. I mean, how do you go about setting up a fund like that? I mean, lots of details to get members to agree on where the money is coming from, how to raise the money, which countries or disasters qualify for the compensation. I mean, how do you put something like that together?
Well, it obviously requires a lot of coordination. Internationally, it also requires financial. It requires, at the end of the day, what you're looking with all these things, you need to also look at private capital supporting projects that are there. The funding is a big fund is one thing, but it also then comes into can you mobilize private capital to come in and support projects on a larger scale? And that is one of the challenges we're meeting as well.
Is that already happening to a certain extent?
We think it is. There is not enough backdrop to actually activate and spark private capital into the entire energy transition sector. You need clear policies, you need support for projects, you need visibility and clear government guidelines and strategies. And in more places than not, that is actually just not there. Strategies change too quickly, visibility isn't there. And then when you have that, though, you can then mobilize capital and you can enable clean capital to drive forward the market and kick off that virtuous spiral.
When you're talking about private capital, are you talking about loans? Because they are grants to countries at the moment, but that is in the form of loans which have to be paid back at some point, and poorer countries struggle to do that.
Well, it is all about, it is the mixture of finance. Finance offers so many rich different structures, possibilities. It's a diverse package what you need, and then it also comes in creating longevity of revenues and business model that enable financing and that enable potential debt service. There may be combinations of these things, especially in the early stages, and probably in early stages you're looking more at grants. Later on you're looking at more loans. Later on yet you're looking at combinations of other instruments as well.
We had some very stark words from Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, at the opening of COP26. And I quote here, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator." What did that statement make you think? And do you think it's going to motivate and put the world's attention back on climate change?
Well, it definitely was a very strong statement, and if we look at where current pathways lead, we know why he is saying that. Clearly, we need to refocus on what the actual temperature outcome could be, and clearly that is not in line with the Paris target at the moment. So we would hope that this refocuses attention onto achieving the Paris target.
Katharina Hillenbrand von der Leyen, Head of Corporate Research and Head of Clean Tech at Carbon Tracker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
After its first discovery of oil in 2015, Guyana is today one of industry's big players. A third of all new oil finds in the world are made off its coast. Now, such a resource could transform the fortunes of a country where 40% of the population earn just over $5 a day. But as the world moves away towards green energy, harvesting the potential riches could prove a challenge. John Hendren travelled to the capital, Georgetown, to interview the nation's president, Irfan Ali.
The temperate waters off the Guyana coast cover some of the world's largest reserves of crude oil. But it's not the oil President Irfan Ali is interested in. It's what he can do with it.
The story about Guyana is not oil and gas. We are a country that is rich in history. We are a country that will be, and mark my words, will be a leader in food security and agriculture. And importantly, we will be among the best ecotourism destination you can find.
And that oil revenue may help you get there faster.
That oil revenue will help us to get there faster.
Guyana's sprawling Stabroek oil field holds an estimated 11 billion barrels of crude, enough to turn one of South America's poorest countries into one of the richest. And contractor ExxonMobil has discovered 2 more deposits, making that field even bigger.
It's big on an international scale, a global scale, as far as the conventional oil and gas resources being found around the world in the last 7-8 years. But also at a national level, this is transformative for the country, for Guyana.
Critics in the opposition party warn of the so-called resource curse that struck other oil-rich nations. It's where some benefit greatly while most miss out.
Stock market has gone up in only a few years, 400%. But the minimum wage has only gone up 36% in the same time period. And so you've seen a huge escalation in terms of inequality.
Some 40% of Guyanese live in poverty, earning below $5.50 a day, according to the World Bank. The influx of oil money has raised rents along with the height of buildings in the capital of Georgetown, center of the petroleum boom.
The infrastructure here in Georgetown has been growing by the day, and for good reason. Since oil was discovered here in 2015, 1/3 of all the new oil found in the world has been off the Guyana coast.
Only a decade ago, Georgetown's Demerara River was a sleepy port. Today, it's a hive of activity as oil service vessels shuffle back and forth to offshore rigs.
The world is trying to move away from oil. Do you feel at all like you're in a race against time here?
Yes, it's a race against time. It must be done responsibly, though, in a sustainable way. But we intend to accelerate the production.
Speeding up production might help this generation prosper while creating a base for the next. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Georgetown, Guyana.
Rising demand for food and falling crop harvests could compromise our ability to feed ourselves. Crop biodiversity helps farmers improve output during tough times. But scientists say as much as 3/4 of that biodiversity was lost during the 20th century. Alessandro Rampietti visits a high-tech facility in Colombia that distributes crucial seeds to vulnerable farmers around the world.
Agronomist Javier Hereda inspects each leaf of this lab-grown bean plant. He has spent the last 4 years studying and nurturing it to save the species from extinction.
It's a wild variety from Costa Rica that's at risk of extinction. This is probably the only remaining specimen in existence. We are regenerating it, simulating its environment. These wild species hold the key to resilience genes that can offer a solution to water deficits, pests and disease.
The seeds of this and tens of thousands of other native plants are collected here on the outskirts of Colombia's third city, Cali, for the world's largest tropical seed bank for beans, cassava and animal feed plants called Future Seeds. In the bank's laboratories, researchers prepare each seed for storage or research, selecting the optimal ones and discarding any that are damaged. Others work on DNA extraction and gene sequencing to decipher and translate the plant's genetic code. Experts say it's vital to breed more resilient crop varieties at a time when food supplies are increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather, deforestation and other human activity.
We have 2 major threats that are existential. One is the genetic erosion. Several of these kind of diversity are disappearing due to urbanization, to roads, to kind of human activity. The second is climate change.
The world used to cultivate more than 6,000 different plants, but it's estimated that about 75% of crop diversity has been lost in the last century. The bank hopes to reverse that trend.
These airtight packages store more than 60,000 samples of beans and forages, and they're kept here in this huge fridge at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Scientists call it an insurance for the future.
Here we hold the seeds that belong, the genetic resources that belong to the countries of origin. We keep them, we conserve and maintain them alive and available also to the public. It's putative solutions to challenges that we cannot imagine at the moment. Already solutions for today's agriculture, but also for the future.
Thanks to donations, the seed bank is using artificial intelligence to speed up crop analysis and breeding new, more resistant varieties, trying to keep pace with an increasingly deteriorating world. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Palmira, Colombia.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Marlene Saeed, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. Check out our website. That'll take you straight to our page, which has lots of individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.